Welcome all to our first panel of the day, America 250, Origins, Evolution, and the Future of the Republic. My name is Sebastian Villamil, a staff writer for the Chicago Thinker and a third year at the college, studying business economics and computer science. We are honored to welcome four incredible panelists to discuss their thoughts on America, its founding principles, and its present course into the future. Starting from right to left, we have David Axelrod. Mr. Axelrod is one of America's most preeminent political strategists, serving as chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama's historic campaigns in 2008 and 2012. He is also the founding director of the University of Chicago's nonpartisan Institute of Politics, having served as its director from 2012 to 2023. He currently serves as chair of its board of advisors. Tom Ginsburg is the founding director of the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression at the University of Chicago. During his career, Mr. Ginsburg has become one of the most frequently cited international law scholars in the country. He is also an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is the co-host of the Entitled podcast. Jonathan Turley is one of America's most prominent legal scholars and constitutional law experts, known for his commentary on high-profile cases and political controversies. He is a well-known supporter of the First Amendment, having authored The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage in 2024. And finally, Dr. John C. Pinheiro is a director at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. He was a former professor at Aquinas College for 18 years of history, and his latest book, co-edited with Dylan Panham, is The Christian Roots of American Liberty, a reader. The panel will be moderated by Akshay Kirthi, class of 2027, majoring in biological sciences, and the current managing editor of the Chicago Thinker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akshay Kirthi. This panel is titled America 250, Origins, Evolution, and the Future of the Republic. On July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, founding a nation that would change human history and one whose ideals, successes, failures, and legacy will be critically discussed today as we near America's 250th anniversary in 1.5 months. I want to start off this discussion by diving into what I see as a growing divide in how we ought to understand America's founding. Fundamentally, is America's founding something to take pride in or apologize for? Many argue that America was founded in 1776 by a dynamic group of businessmen, military officers, and scholars who fought against tyranny and founded a nation built on ideals that would far outlive them and the flaws of their time. Another perspective, one I find to be increasingly common in academic circles, contextualizes America's founding at 1619, when slaves first arrived to what would become America. They understand America as an imperialist empire founded on discrimination and hypocrisy. First, I want to turn to David Axelrod. How do you understand America's founding?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm the House Liberal here, so in the interest of free expression, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, and I have a high regard for everybody here, and applaud all you young conservatives for being here on what may be one of the most beautiful days of the year. So you're really showing your commitment. I want to preface my answer by saying I'm the most grateful American there can be, because my father was a refugee from Eastern Europe, and he came here and his family, when he was a child, with his family, and they came to pursue that ideal that's encoded in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One generation later, I was the senior advisor to a president of the United States. This is a phenomenal country, and I am deeply appreciative of it. To say that I am proud of my country is not to say that I think our country has not made mistakes, that our country wasn't flawed. One of the genius elements of the Founding Fathers is they understood the imperfections of human beings. And so in launching this unbelievably audacious experiment of self-government, they understood that one of the great obstacles was the imperfections of people, even those who were, Thomas Jefferson had 600 slaves over the course of his life. And he understood the conflict in writing about the equality of men and being a slaveholder. We're not perfect people. What is the genius of America is we've created a structure that allows us to keep trying to perfect our union, to keep trying to overcome those problems and imperfections. And I love that about our country. So I'm very proud of it. I'm also proud of my kids, but I don't love everything they ever did. So let me just end with that.
John Pinheiro, if you could chime in.
Yeah, I'd actually echo some of what David was saying. The first is I think about our country, and I think about, so it would be my grandfather who immigrated at 12 and spoke Portuguese most of his life and was illiterate and would sign with an X. And then here I am in 2005 presenting a book I had edited to President Bush in the Oval Office talking about who we were calling the other GW that day. And I just recall very vividly looking out the windows of the White House and thinking, I'm sure my grandfather would have just been happy if I had owned a business on the street corner or a food cart or something. This was just an amazing journey. I do view the history of the United States as one of the growth of liberty. So I wouldn't start that trend in 1619. There's with the 1619 project, there are tremendous problems in terms of historiography, and both historians on the left and the right, people like Sean Wilentz, have criticized them for that. But the best thing we can think about the founders is not to engage in that kind of question that evangelicals were doing many years ago, the what would Jesus do question. We don't always want to ask what the founders would do. We want to think about them as flawed people. I would take those flawed founders as a group over flawed people in any particular time period. That is, despite their flaws, look at what was produced, look at what was put together. The mention of Thomas Jefferson is a great example. When the abolitionists were arguing to abolish slavery in the 1830s, they were quoting Thomas Jefferson, which forced the pro-slavery forces to hate Jefferson and to criticize Jefferson. And we move on to the civil rights movement, and they're quoting Jefferson through the Declaration of Independence. And so there's words that can be lived up to or not lived up to, but I think the value for me then in looking at the American founding is always going to be the history and the context. And it doesn't mean we contextualize ourselves out of how amazing some of these things were. And it also means we don't just spend our time vilifying. If we look within ourselves, we know we each as individuals have issues and problems, and these folks had issues and problems. But I think at least in Jefferson's case, and he figures prominently in the 250th, doesn't he? He knew he had problems. I wish he would have overcome them better than he did. But at least he was aware of them. That's more than I can say for some.
Let's go to Jonathan Turley.
Well, thank you. It's awkward, but I'm going to have to correct one thing from the bio, and that is not my bio, David's bio, that they left out that he was also the campaign strategist for my mother, Angela Turley, when she ran for the 46th Ward alderman here in Chicago. And as my brother Christopher and my sister-in-law Julie are here, we'd like to think that President Obama was really his effort to find Angela Turley 2.0. But there's no reason for him to remember this among all of his campaigns. But it's a pleasure to be here with David and all of this distinguished panel. It's a great question, and one that we have to ask to fully understand not only why we are here today, but who we are. People often forget that the American Revolution was the first true Enlightenment revolution. The Enlightenment writers had been out for a long time. But the American Revolution was something of a fascination for people around the world. In my new book, Rage in the Republic, I talk about the reaction and the sort of elements and personalities that came together to create this unique republic. And one of the things I quote in Rage in the Republic often is a French writer by the name of Crèvecoeur, who wrote a very popular French book. He was here as a farmer, and he tried to explain to Europe who these people are. And in his book, he asked, what then is this American? And I asked that a lot in my book, because I'm not sure we can answer that question, or whether people are prepared to answer that question. Who were we then, and who are we now? This revolution was unique and fascinating because people couldn't understand how a people that had very little in common with each other, didn't have land in common or stratified social institutions, even religion in common, how they could come together at this point on the planet and create the world's first major Enlightenment revolution. And they wanted to know, as if we were some type of new species, who are these people whose legacy is a legacy of ideas? This concept, this idea that's captured in the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, that the rights of individuals come from God, not from government, that they are natural rights. They adhere to us as human beings, human rights, like free speech, free religion. That's what fascinated people so much about us then. But of course, you're all familiar with Franklin's challenge about it's your republic if you can keep it. The reason my book is entitled Rage in the Republic, the Unfinished Story of the American Revolution, is because this story probably will never be finished, precisely for the reason that Franklin said. Every generation will have to renew its commitment. And the question then again is, are we prepared now to answer that question of who we are and why we are so unique? I am very proud, as with everyone on this panel, to be an American. I also had an illiterate grandfather who was a coal miner. And this country has given a great deal to our family. But the question for this generation is, what can we pass along? And specifically, can we pass along a republic? Can we keep this republic? And there are sort of a rise of people who are questioning some of the core institutions and values. In the book, I compare the American and French revolutions. And one became the most successful, stable democracy in history. The other became the terror. And the book asks why. What were the unique elements that created those two different trajectories? And part of the answer is that the framers wanted to avoid the historical trend of democracies becoming what Benjamin Rush called mobocracies. So, Madison famously said that in Athens, if every citizen was a Socrates, it would still have been a mob. That is because the system itself didn't protect it from being devoured by itself. It didn't protect it from its own passions. That's what's unique about the American Republic, is it created a system that could hold all of the passions that are produced by democracy. And that's how I view it.
Tom Ginsburg.
Great, thank you. I'd also like to thank you all for putting this on. And actually, when we were starting the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, first group of students I talked to were those from the Thinker. Christopher here was one of our very first students who showed up. So it's great to see you again. And I want to thank you all for putting this on. The way I think about this problem is I think about the American Revolution as lasting, about 25 years or so. You get from 1776, which is the 250 we're celebrating, but then the much more difficult moment of 1787, negotiating the Constitution, and then implementing, or sometimes they'd say liquidating the Constitution, which really goes up till 1801 or so because of the incredibly contested election that happened in 1800. The whole thing could have fallen apart at any one of those moments. And thinking specifically about the 1776, I feel like that is truly something which is universal. You take these Lockean ideas of life, liberty, and property that everyone's supposed to have. You then say, no, it's actually life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can choose your own way, the Enlightenment ideals that Jonathan was just talking about. There's many ways to do that, many ways to live and many ways to live together. And to me, those things are universal. I think even the critics are operating within that tradition. It's like democracy. Even North Korea says it's a democratic republic. Everyone says they're for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those freedom ideals might not be honored in every place, but they have won the normative battle. And everywhere, and this is why I believe, even though in an era of democratic decline that we're in, I'm still optimistic about democracy because I don't think people like to live under tyranny of any sort. And I think that you're going to always see these claims that are ultimately grounded in the 1776 ideal. So I think they are fairly universal. I'm going to say the 1787 thing is much more difficult and maybe much more contentious. And the reason it was more difficult is because that involved bargaining. Everyone pretty much in the United States didn't want to be ruled by King George. But now we've got to put together some kind of system of government for us to live together under. That was really hard. And there's, of course, very well studied, well documented. That's the experiment which seems to be most, I don't want to say fragile, but it's got some challenges today. And I have a lot of thoughts on what those are, but I don't want to take up this moment to do that, to talk about it.
So I'm kind of seeing like a sense of optimism from the four of you about the fact that ideals can outlive, the problems of the time that they were created in. Kind of shifting gears towards, the structure of American government. When the Constitution was first ratified in 1788, it established a governmental and political system that bears similarities to what our current system is today, but also striking differences. For example, in 1788, there was no federal income tax. Most federal revenue came from tariffs. There was no welfare state. The federal government was extremely small and lacked a large administrative state. In fact, I looked up and found that apparently America's first attorney general worked part-time on the job. And then also, most legal and political power was delegated to the states. I want to turn to you, Jonathan Turley, with your legal expertise. Can you kind of walk us through how these transformations in the scope of the federal government emerged over time?
Yeah, some of the changes that you identify really did create rippling effects throughout the system. One of the things that I talk to my students about is that law professors tend to downplay the Declaration of Independence. Even justices like Scalia downplay the Declaration of Independence, which I don't. The Declaration of Independence is the document that defined us as a people. The Constitution, and I'm saying this against interest because I'm viewed as a Madisonian scholar, so I should be talking up the Constitution at every turn. But the Constitution was really the document that made good on the promise of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence defined us. What Madison gave us was a brilliant system that guaranteed those things, guaranteed those individual rights. And he was the ultimate wonk. That's why when people come up to me after speeches and say, I just love reading the US Constitution, I know they've never read it, because the fact is, it reads like the tax code. There's nothing particularly beautiful about the US Constitution. It was written by a wonk. But its beauty was in its functionality to achieve what was in the Declaration of Independence. Now, what you identified is really key here, and probably the two most significant challenges was the federal income tax and the direct election of senators, because the core principle in the Madisonian system is to avoid the concentration of power in the hands of any one individual or any one branch. That's why, in many ways, Newtonian physics were the rage back then, and certainly Madison was part of that. And it's why, if you look at Madison's writings, it's filled with Newtonian references of treating the three branches like planets captured in a stable orbit. And so the way that he protected that system was to have systems to prevent the concentration of power between the branches, but also a system of federalism so that much of that power is still rested with the states. Those two changes you mentioned took out the two major protections of states. That is, the fact that states would elect U.S. senators gave them a huge amount of power, that the legislature would do it, not the voters, gave them a huge amount of influence over the Senate. And the fact that they controlled the vast majority of revenue gave them probably the most important lever of control. The federal government had to work with states in order to get anything done. So those two things were changed and it wasn't an attack on federalism, they were changed for different reasons. So one of the problems that the Supreme Court has had, and this has been one of the most interesting debates among liberal and conservative justices, is what are we going to do about that? That is, for conservative justices, they argue, look, we still have the 10th Amendment, you still have a constitution that guarantees federalism, so we need to put a little more shoulder to the wheel to make sure that we preserve that balance. Others, like Ginsburg's position was, no, those were constitutional amendments, people passed them, and so I don't particularly have to work to sort of reinforce states' rights. And that is part of the natural give that occurs within our system. Both those views, by the way, are good faith views and were argued beautifully by both sides. But it also shows, and I'll wrap this up, is that there's a difference between dealing with constitutional changes like that within a framework that continues to adhere to our values. Other changes could change the system in a destabilizing way. And I include the call for packing the Supreme Court and other changes that are being put forward today. Those are changes that are the one thing we could do on the 250th anniversary to guarantee we don't have another.
Anyone else have thoughts about packing of the Supreme Court?
Well, no one would admit to being in favor of it, but I might argue that the Supreme Court has been packed already through Senator McConnell's manipulation of the appointment process at the end of the Obama administration, and then changing his mind after my namesake, Justice Ginsburg, passed away about what the principle was for how long we would allow a Supreme Court, how long we would have a delay in an appointment. To me, that was a very destabilizing act. It's the kind of thing that happens all the time. Parties are always bargaining with each other, but it was definitely an escalation. And we're at a moment where the parties are there's so much polarization in the country. There's so little of that spirit of 76 where we're all together fighting some, other enemy, that those kind of moves, I think, are really quite dangerous. I'm not in favor of court packing in response.
But can I disagree on one point? Because I've heard this before, that I argue that Merrick Garland should have gotten a vote. I opposed what McConnell did in writing. But that's not court packing. They didn't increase the size of the Supreme Court. What they're talking about today is adding an instant liberal majority to the Supreme Court. I think there is a difference. I didn't like what they did with Merrick Garland. I made that very, very clear. But that's not packing. I mean, it falls into politics ain't beanbag. And unfortunately, McConnell did what he did.
Go ahead. I just want to widen the aperture a little bit of this discussion, because part of the characteristics of the Constitution was this acknowledgement that, number one, people are imperfect, systems are imperfect, and we ought to have the mechanism to improve and change them. The other, and Jonathan kind of references this, that a functioning democracy, which was, as I said earlier, an audacious experiment, and which Franklin echoed with his admonition, requires that there are rules and laws and norms and institutions, and that they will be respected by the people in these offices. And if we embrace the idea that rules and laws and norms and institutions are only valid when we agree with how they decide issues or where they lead us, in a kind of ideological or partisan way, we undermine the fundamental genius of the structure. I will say, just as an aside, when President Obama got elected in 2008, there was a transition, and President Bush was incredibly gracious to us in every single way in making that transition work. And I told him the day of the inauguration, and I said it publicly, and I say it now, it was really so inspiring. It was a great exhibition of patriotism and an understanding that he was a trustee of this democracy, and as a trustee, he should pass it along to the next person who the people had chosen, even though he might not like everything we said during the campaign, or he might not agree with everything we would do. We are losing that in our politics right now. We have this zero-sum game politics, and we have lost our respect for the value of rules and laws and norms and institutions. We should challenge them, for sure. That's part of the process. But we have to recognize their importance. And if we embrace a philosophy that the strong, that the law of the jungle and the strong take what they want and the weak fall away, and rules and laws and norms and institutions are for suckers, then I think we truly doom this experiment.
I think maybe like ensuing tensions between like transitions in power in the executive branch really imply that the executive branch has a very important role to play in government. We've seen like recent advances by the administration to try to kind of expand the scope of executive power in things like, temporary wartime powers and, the institution of like emergency tariffs. I'm kind of wondering, what do you guys think about like expansion of the executive branch, or what ought to be like the core function of the executive branch today? And then like how is that similar and different from how it was intended in 1788?
Maybe I could start. When they were drafting the Constitution, they knew that the executive would be important, but they thought of it mainly, I think, as a sort of foreign policy thing. They were lucky. In fact, that whole period I was talking about, 1776 to 1801, might not have happened had it not been for the unique presence of George Washington, who everyone knew would be the first president. The office was sort of designed for him in some sense. And they didn't pay as much attention in the constitutional drafting process to the executive so much as they did to issues of federalism and the powers of Congress. They really thought Congress would be the most dangerous branch, if you will. I think we've gotten to a point where executive power has, through those incremental changes that you described, gotten to be very, very high indeed. Congress, of course, can't do anything, it seems like. And so we're sort of governed by a 1.5 branch system at this point, I sometimes say. I fear this very deeply. I've been reading a lot of Hayek recently, who taught in my building and I think has a lot of eternal wisdom for us. The problem with an imbalanced constitutional order, where the executive is so powerful, and we've seen incredible extra constitutional claims by the administration, I won't go list them all, is it disincentivizes the rotation of office. Like, you can't build up one branch so high and then lose an election and act like President Bush. That's not going to happen. And I really fear for that. I think we're heading towards a crisis because of that imbalance, that in any kind of close election, there will be manipulation to try to keep it. And that's solely a function of the court allowing the executive to take a lot of power and Congress not doing its job.
Anyone want to chime in?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I think that, we hear the term crisis a lot. I just had a debate with a Harvard law professor about whether we're in a constitutional crisis. I don't think we are. I think that we have a crisis of faith, particularly among law professors. A lot of them are arguing for the trashing of the US Constitution. We have a number of books on that. We're like a priesthood that has lost its faith but kept its frocks. And we just lecture at cold altars about how we have to change this system. I don't think it is a constitutional crisis. What my colleague from Harvard got wrong, in my view, is that he said, look, we're getting so little done. We have to change the system. Congress is useless. And he argued that this was in favor of democracy. What he was witnessing is democracy. This country is divided right down the middle. Right down the middle. Whole states are divided 50-50. And when we're divided like that, less gets done. That's what happens in a democracy. We can't agree. It doesn't mean that democracy is failing. We have to agree. And in an age of rage, as I've called it in the past, less gets done. It's not our first age of rage, but It burns off in time. We realize that we've become grotesque, that we have become addicted to rage. I think this is what David was picking up on, and I agree entirely with it. Eventually, we realize that the rage is corrupting us, but it's not a constitutional crisis. And I agree with the increased power of the executive, but on that as well, often people twist that history to their advantage. If you take something like the War Powers Act and Iran and Venezuela, there are good faith arguments about challenging what President Trump did there, and those are arguments I think should be given serious weight. But every president in this republic has contested the argument of Congress that they could dictate whether a president can commit forces like that. Thomas Jefferson with the Barbary Pirates made that very, very clear. Presidents under our system have and will continue to have the ability to start a war, because there's no way around that. They have to be able to respond quickly. Congress has the ability to stop the war by stopping funding. The War Powers Act itself has been challenged on its constitutionality by every president in my lifetime. In fact, I represented members opposing Obama's Libyan war as an undeclared war. And let me just say, it did not go well. But I was not too surprised. I represented members of Congress who felt that Obama had unilaterally declared war on Libya. And the fact is that the courts have left that to the political process. So it's not that it means that Trump is right or wrong in what he's doing, but people need to have some context and history to this debate. This is not the first time this has come up.
Oh, I'm sorry, John.
Go to Pinheiro.
Yeah.
No, please.
So the mention of history brings up something that I think is very important. And one of the things we could do with the past is turn it into one long morality play. We can do that with the present too, but it's not just a matter of the election of 1800. So some folks would like to look at the election of 1800, which was decided in the House, and say, look at this great moment in American democracy, and it was peacefully settled. But Virginia called out its militia just in case Jefferson wasn't chosen. And in 1860, of course, it was even worse. So my warning as an historian is always to say, beware the influencer, and beware the technocrat, and beware the political operative who tells you things are worse than they've ever been, and that the next election is the most consequential election you'll ever participate in, you'll ever get to vote for. That's the zero-sum game, which was mentioned earlier. That's very dangerous stuff. The country's been divided before. We're still here 250 years later. The Civil War is a pretty big speed bump. We don't want to forget about that. Nor should I think we forget about the first Constitution, which only lasted a few years, the Articles of Confederation. If I was going to look at the Declaration in the 250th anniversary, I would look at the Articles of Confederation first, because that's where you imbued the revolution in the government. The Constitution is the lesson that the Articles maybe weren't good enough. But what I wouldn't do is look at, so I don't use phrases like the Lockean ideas or legacy of ideas to describe the Constitution and the founding. I think the danger there is to present that constitutional formula as an ideology of the kind that went wrong in the French Revolution. So I guess I agree with those like Russell Kirk, who would argue that the American Revolution primarily was a conservative event, preserving liberties long practiced, long lived, and the streams of thought going into those kinds of liberties weren't created by John Locke. They weren't created out of whole cloth by the founders. They had a long legacy in Western history and Judeo and Christian culture. But it's true they had never come together in one polity before. And so will we start to get into the realm of ideas only? That's where the will to power creeps in, I think, and that's where we want to vanquish the enemy, and then we have the friend-enemy distinction.
Can I just say a couple of things? One is, and I say this to my liberal friends, Donald Trump has made me more of a conservative, and it's around this very issue. Because I grew up in a home. My parents were they were kids when Roosevelt saved America in their view, and created sort of the modern presidency and arrogated to himself a lot of power to do it. I mean, he blazed a lot of new trails, and we came to look at the president in that sort of model of leadership, and succeeding Democratic presidents certainly followed in that. In some ways, Republicans as well. But what I've learned is that what I think the founders knew, which is that this works assuming good faith on the part of everyone who holds these offices. And if the person in the office doesn't actually believe in these fundamental ideals, it doesn't work. And so we see, now we have courts, and the courts are there, and there's still a guardrail. But I have a little bit more reticence about the exercise of executive power than I did before. The second thing is, you mentioned the country's divided down the middle. One thing that's different today, and every era is different, but we live in an era of new technology and social media. The platform, the profit sort of model of the platform is to keep people online, and their great insight is the way you keep people online is through anger, outrage, resentment, conspiracy theories. And it doesn't really matter whether you're left or right, or they just figure they have more data about us than we know about ourselves, and they shove us into our silos, and our views are always affirmed but not necessarily informed. And everybody outside the silo is not just someone with a different background or a different point of view, but someone who's alien and dangerous and un-American. And so we have this and unlike other forms of community, we always had yellow journalism, and we could choose papers that reflected our point of view, but we made that choice. This is a sort of involuntary process where the algorithms decide what we'll see and what will stimulate us, and it's created an environment in which compromise and cohesion is harder than it's been. And I think, and this causes, when you have terminal gridlock in Congress, it causes presidents to want to exercise more executive authority. So we have a lot of elements here that we have to address in furtherance of our mandate from the founders to renew the republic and keep it healthy. And I think if we don't confront these issues, I'm not as sanguine as you guys are about what the future will bring.
So you think you're free, but you're manipulated by algorithms every day. And the thing you should do before you leave today is delete the social media off your phone and then not look at it. That sounds like something simple, and it does sound very like the old guy over 50 telling you to, take that off your phone. But it was something the other Frenchman, not Quebecois, but Tocqueville said when he looked at American mores and said, here's some of the ideas, here's the reasons American democracy survives. But one of them he identified, he called mores, which I guess the best translation for that's going to be customs or traditions. What I take from that is, despite what the Americans might seem like, and there were a lot of European critics in the 19th century, Charles Dickens among them, who came and just described us as barbarians, for example, particularly at table. But this is what they might be like, and yet they're better than their theories when you get to know them, and so are your neighbors. And so you get off your social media and you go out your door and you solve issues with your neighbors, and you don't nationalize everything. I think the nationalization of our politics, which I think can be laid at the door of direct election of senators, in part at least, pulling state representation out of the federal system entirely. But that's like a non-political way to look at things. Yeah. We were talking baseball, this panel, beforehand, and it didn't take me more than 2 minutes to realize this was not the moment to promote the Detroit Tigers as the greatest team of the American Midwest. But we just,
if you look at the standings, it's not a moment to promote the Detroit Tigers.
Yeah. But that's just that typical kind of moment where you're doing something with your neighbor, whether we call that the principle of federalism, subsidiarity, local. I don't think people should think globally and act locally. I think it's actually the other way around. I would.
No, but I think you really captured the beauty of this country, that even though we were divided between the Tigers and the Cubs. We were united in our common hatred of the White Sox. And I say that for Scott's purpose since he's a White Sox fan. But I want to add two things as a follow-up. One is, I wouldn't say we're at the 1.5 on the tripartite system. The court system has been functioning quite well. And it has, if you look at the average in terms of presidents, Trump is a little bit below average in terms of being upheld by the Supreme Court, but it's fairly consistent in terms of presidents as how the court has ruled. As you know, the president has not liked that and has attacked the Supreme Court justices, something I've criticized him for. And it's not going to have any impact on the justices. But the court system is functioning. It has its own problems. The national injunction issue, I think, has been largely resolved by the Supreme Court. And we're seeing a decline in trial courts issuing national injunctions. The other thing that I was going to note, and this is, I agree with so much that you've said, so I don't want to suggest that this is anything but a small point. When we get back to the founding, I'm going to make one more pitch for the Enlightenment revolution. It is true that these ideas existed before. The Declaration of Independence is a true Lockean document. I mean, it just echoes Locke throughout the Declaration of Independence. And I find it funny that some law professors have indicated they don't believe Locke had as much influence as he did. I really don't understand how you could say that if you read something like the Declaration of Independence and some of the other documents. But we also created some unique aspects, and I would point to the First Amendment as a uniquely American voice. If you look at just free speech in the First Amendment, that was not a byproduct of Great Britain. I mean, the framers actually liked a lot of stuff out of Great Britain. They reproduced a lot of it. They liked the system overall. But Great Britain never did protect free speech very well, and it certainly doesn't today. There were levelers and others back in Great Britain that espoused a natural right for free speech. But the First Amendment was almost unique as this roaring endorsement in a constitutional form of free speech. So I think we do have some more unique elements there. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I mean, in part, so what the amendments are doing, it wasn't just George Washington's presence that made the anti-federalists, that kept them from being counter-revolutionaries, but as Patrick Henry said, let's care for the crazy machine. We'll see how it goes. The last Constitution lasted 5 years. Maybe this one will last 10, but we've got Washington around. It was the promise of a Bill of Rights, which Madison at first opposed at the Constitutional Convention. But I would look at those as codifying liberties that were already present, and it's a concern that if you create a new national government, you don't want it to establish a national church, for example. But states had established churches, some of them up until the early 1830s, like Connecticut. And it's accurate to say, I would agree, especially about Britain. When we talk about the Sedition Act in 1798, there were worse versions of the Alien and Sedition Acts in Britain at the time, right? So there were worse versions in some states than the one at the federal level. So one of the things I think is important to keep in mind about the Declaration is, number one, I would agree that there's Lockean elements, but I would also add there were over 100 declarations of independence by colonies and municipalities and other groups. This is Congresses. It's a committee document. The Declaration of Independence is not a systematic treatise on government. Jefferson wrote one book, edited a secret book, but wrote one book, and that was his notes on the state of Virginia. But Congress heavily edited to the tune of hundreds of words. I think like 500 words edited out of Jefferson's Declaration. And the part we usually don't read or celebrate, especially on big anniversaries, are all those grievances, which to me reads a lot like you all know more about law than I do, so you tell me if I'm wrong. Reads much like a document in the common law tradition of England and that tradition of petitions and declarations against the king, against the local lord, than it does, say, an explosion of liberty in a systematic treatise written by a committee and then heavily edited by another committee.
If I may, for purposes of time, I kind of want to shift this discussion towards, a discussion about ideals versus heritage. I see this as a growing conflict on one of the most fundamental questions defining America's 250th anniversary. What does it truly mean to be an American today? I think this tension can be quite aptly described using two quotes. In his farewell speech, Ronald Reagan said, quote, "You can go live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or a Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." Let's contrast that to an excerpt from J.D. Vance's RNC speech upon being accepted to be the vice president. He said, quote, "America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation." After he then described the 5 generations of his ancestors that were buried in a rural Kentucky cemetery, he argued that, quote, "People will not fight for abstractions, but they will fight for their homeland." This question is for John Pinheiro. How would you answer, what does it mean to be an American? Is being an American defined by a belief in a set of ideals, or is being an American defined by a heritage and sacrifices over generations?
Well, I wouldn't qualify as a so-called heritage American. I think so. History is complex. The one thing Reagan got wrong there, and I'm a proud Reagan zombie on most days, but the one thing Reagan gets wrong is that's the tension you see, and I think in a lot of European countries right now with immigration from folks outside of Europe. That tension's very much there. Can you? I think you can under the law, but does that mean the people there, right, who trace their nationhood to ethnicity are going to hold that to be different? So this is the creed versus culture debate. I don't think it has to be an either or. So I guess this is where I would say that I would ask a different question, and I would beware of anyone who engages in this kind of true Scotsman fallacy of who the real Americans are, whether they're on the right or on the left, whoever they're reading out of the picture. I mean, there's the legal answer of citizenship, and then there's the answer of the ideals, if we can find the common ground for the 5 or 6 ideals. So I think it's a very dangerous view. It's a view that when the Society of Cincinnati was being founded in the 1780s, there was concern that would grow into an order of nobility. And there was some question whether Washington should support that or not. Would it establish like these Americans are more important than the other Americans because they can trace their ancestry to the Mayflower or to the Revolution or to veteran status? Are the families of veterans going to have some kind of higher social credit score as some countries would apply than others? These are all questions worth working through, but I think the answer over time tends towards the creed. But when we talk about the 1780s and 1790s, certainly those folks were defending what they knew best from new encroachment. Burke described it well in his conciliation speech, trying to understand the Americans. Like the English were just, they get taxed and they say, "Give me more." And the Americans, you lower their tax 400% in the Tea Act, and they rebel because they don't want to pay it at all because they say it's an unjust tax. And this just didn't make sense to the English. And the answer was, for Burke, Americans had been living free for 160 years, and now it's a shock to the system. So that's certainly an argument for heritage there, but I don't think you can apply that in 2026.
Yeah, I want to echo that because there's something deeply offensive about the concept of heritage American for most Americans. In Raging Republic, I tell the story in some ways through the life of Thomas Paine. I follow him because he's one of 2 figures that played a major role in both revolutions, the other being Lafayette. And it almost killed both of them when they went to Paris and became part of the terror or got caught up in it. But in many ways, when you ask what is an American, I really, in my book, I suggest the answer can be found in Thomas Paine. He was an incredibly principled and courageous person. He was also obnoxious and reckless. He had failed in everything he had ever done. Every business he created ended up in bankruptcy. Every job he ever held, he was fired from. And he ended up in London in front of someone, just a pile of human wreckage, without a penny, without a friend. And one person looked at him and saw something that no one else did. And that was Benjamin Franklin. And he bought a ticket for Paine to go to the United States. And I think that Franklin, maybe it takes genius to see genius. He saw something. John Adams saw something in him. When people said that John Adams wrote Common Sense, he told his wife, I couldn't have written that book, but I think I know who did. There's a man named Thomas Paine, and he had genius in his eyes. But the only point about this is he came to this country a human wreck. He even added an E to his name and reinventing himself. Within 2 years, he wrote Common Sense and was called the penman of the American Revolution. And I think that what brings people to this country is this idea that we can create our own manifest destiny here, that we can be anything we want to be here. That's what Thomas Paine proved. In many ways, I think that is what it means to be an American.
Yeah, can I just echo what Jonathan said? You know, this question comes up about does American exceptionalism? That is what makes American exceptional. I told you about my own personal history, but it's the history of so many. And to me, that commitment to those ideals of the Declaration, to the rule of law, and to this principle that everyone should have the opportunity to chase their dreams and make the most of themselves. And I think that our common mission, we may have different ideas about how to get there, but our common mission is to keep that alive and keep that real. It's what's made us a beacon to the world, and we don't want to extinguish that beacon and make ourselves exactly like every other country. We're not like every other country. We were founded on an ideal, and we should preserve that ideal.
Can I add something? I think we should think about this also in terms of demography. We all know why Vice President Vance is pushing this line. It's politically expedient for some of his supporters. But if you think about it, we're the only country in the West, in the industrialized world, that doesn't have this conception of an ethnic basis for the country. And that's a great virtue, because we alone, in this era of massive demographic decline in the rich world, I mean, rich countries are not replicating themselves. So the only country that is going to be able to survive that is the country which has a system of immigration where, we have legal immigration, people come in and we absorb them into the country. The other demographic point is we are unique, I think, among these countries in that we really don't care very much. We are a mestizo country, and people don't talk about this enough, but everyone marries everybody over time. In a generation or two, let's take the Hispanic population now. After a generation or two in the country, what's the word? Endogamy, I guess is the technical term. Marrying outside of your group. It happens at the same rate as everybody else. Our history is full of groups that were discriminated against. I think of Germans in World War I. People were changing their name because they didn't want to be known as Germans. And well, now we think of Germans as, German Americans as just like any other white American. All of those categories are constantly blending, and we should celebrate that and not divide ourselves up. I think it would help us leverage our unique advantage in the industrialized world.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the rubber really hits the road on this one in terms of like immigration policy and ideas of cultural identity. Just to spearhead an argument, many people worry that, through treating American identity as merely an adherence to a set of ideals, it opens the door for large-scale immigration over time to displace the culture that fundamentally makes America what it is. What do you guys make of this?
Well, it's a familiar argument. We've heard it in other periods in our history.
Yeah.
And in very much the same terms. What has happened is that people have added to the strength and buoyancy of our country, both in terms of economics and culture as well. I think what is true is that people need to have faith in an immigration system that is working, that where there's actual borders and we have some idea about who's coming in, and which is separate from racial profiling and some of the things that we saw here in Chicago and elsewhere. But I go back every once in a while and read what Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was saying in the late 19th century, and it's not coincidental that this happened in a period of great economic change, the Industrial Revolution, the period of the robber barons and so on, and there was great disquiet among people who were feeling displaced, and there was an audience for these kinds of arguments, but we've overcome them in the past, and I think to the strength of our country.
My last question is for Tom Ginsburg. A poll by NBC News found that today only 27% of Generation Z, my generation, say that they're proud to be Americans. As a pre-med student, I meet people every week who feel disaffected from American institutions, including medicine. What needs to be done to keep people proud of a nation that will forever fall short of its ideals in some way?
That's a tough question. I mean, first of all,
Glad you got it.
Yeah, really. Why did I get that one? I mean, it's a shocking statistic, and yet, I think I think it's one of these statistics which you shouldn't put too much weight in. A lot of times we see cohort effects in these things, and age effects, so that when you're, it's something people might say when they're in their 20s or millennials. By the time they're 30, and they realize, wow, this country's economy is like a machine that just can't be stopped. I mean, it's amazing. And if you travel as much as I do and you see countries that, aren't delivering anything to their citizens, then you really see it's a wealth machine. It's a machine where if you work hard, you can get by. That's why people come here. There's so many things that make the country great that I think people over time tend to pick those up. But it also is something that we should not ignore, because it's a sign that the perception of the social contract is that it's breaking down. And so what can we do? I don't know, but I do spend a lot of time in the university thinking about this, like how it's related to some of the points Scott was making earlier about what universities can do. And I think partly what we can do is to fight the siloization that's going on. People are probably repeating things that they saw on the social media. It's hip to be disenchanted. We have to provide a space where we can talk about these things and talk about the good and bad quite openly, without ideology and without fear or favor. And that itself is the most American thing you can do. So to me, practicing what we preach within universities is a small step that's within our grasp to take.
Can
I'll let Axelrod respond, then we'll open up.
Can I respond to my tenured friend for a second?
Yeah.
I don't think it's mythology, or there are changes in the economy. It is harder for younger people today than it was in previous generations. The entry level, I hear it from our own students when they leave here. But I think the thing that we need to really emphasize is part of what you get for being an American and living in this economy, living in this country, is you get the tools to try and affect change and to bring about policies and to promote ideas that might improve not just your situation, but improve generally conditions. And I think one of the reasons I'm here, Christopher invited me. We worked together when he was a student here. He would participate in the Institute of Politics, where we try and have these kinds of discussions all the time. And the reason that I do that work and the reason I started the Institute of Politics is because I'm actually inspired by these young people who I meet every day, from right to left, because they are invested in the project of perfecting our country. And they may disagree on how to do it, but they are not submitting to cynicism and despair. And the best thing we can do is encourage young people to use the tools that are available to them, not just the personal tools to advance themselves, but the tools that are available to them to help perfect this experiment that we're talking about in ways that are constructive. And part of it involves talking to people who you may have different views with, and approaching them with an open mind and a willingness to hear and perhaps learn, and to recognize their common humanity and their common patriotism, and not try and dominate each other. And those are the values that we promote at the Institute of Politics. I think that's the value that Tom promotes on the campus. And I'm here in that spirit.
All right, let's open it up for questions. Gentlemen, and yeah. Guy standing up.
Thank you. Sorry for the mix-up. I want to engage on a sort of philosophical question that seems to be underlying. There was the topic of European nations and these people considering themselves a nation because of their blood and their ancestry, as opposed to the American nation. But more and more we see that American influence has brought these ideas into Europe. And we see the children of immigrants in these European nations, I've seen a lot in Britain specifically, say that they are, in this case, British because they were born there, which is ultimately not a constituting British value. I'm curious if you think that in the same way that, and this goes to anyone, that republics are now the majority form of government around the world, at least in name. If you think that this idea will spread, and what consequences you see for the world at large in this nation as an ideal concept spreading.
I guess, was that directed at me?
No,
Looking at it,
it's a jump ball.
I'm happy to answer too after this.
So republics, one of the things we forget as Americans is that we actually have the oldest republic in the Western world. So we're told all the time how young our country is. But the French have got, correct me if I'm wrong, is it at least five or six republics in 1789? And most of them haven't ended well when they transitioned to the new one, right? And so when Washington wrote to a synagogue as president, he talked about our liberal policy, and he was referring to religious liberty specifically. But what he also said is, this is worthy of imitation. Now, that's not the same thing as writing a constitution for a country and dropping it on the country, as Franklin Roosevelt did to Haiti and others have done to other countries, and then say, here, go. I mean, there's a context and capabilities. There's all kinds of things that matter. So I don't know that the rest of the world is being Americanized in this way. I see tensions that point to American distinctiveness on this score.
I think I would say that maybe I disagree. I think it is, to some degree, a generalization of the way we've organized our society. And it does go back to 1776. I talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But remember, the other part of that sentence is equality. All men are created equal. And that's a really radical idea at that time, of course. And it took us it was something we're still struggling with. But what it means is, at the international sphere, when those things get adopted into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and human rights instruments, is that you can't just discriminate against someone in your country because of their ethnicity and such. And that, because the economics of those societies have led to much more immigration, they're really struggling with it. But in a way, because of that American ideal, there's no real choice then to integrate people into a more American conception of what the nation is, and it's very difficult, very challenging for them.
All right, next question. Gentleman all the way in the back middle. Yeah.
Hello, first of all, thank you all for coming here. I'm glad, we've had at least you have all had a kind of a conversational tone. I think I'm interested in sort of the, of course, someone mentioned I forget which of you four mentioned the sort of Judeo-Christian roots of these. And so I'm very interested, especially sort of in the modern evangelical movement that sort of, kind of first sort of had a very varied history, but now especially in the new Republican sphere is becoming a very distinctive ideology. So I'm wondering what the interplay is between, this sort of a deeply religious, sometimes apocalyptic tradition in Judeo-Christianity, and sort of the founders, many of whom, of course, were deists, and sort of that rational sector of the Enlightenment. I'm wondering, how these sort of fit together in the American project and what their place together is in the future. Thank you.
Well, this is where I get to talk about my book, which Jonathan's very, very good about. The Acton Institute recently published The Christian Roots of American Liberty, a reader. Its primary sources, and the primary sources in there date back to the 3rd century, the 2nd century. They run through the medieval period. And what we see often enough in the actual sources, don't take my word for it, don't take anyone on the panel's word for it, but you look in the sources and you see, for example, Tertullian in the 3rd century. Tertullian, among other things, besides coining the term Trinity for Christians, he wrote about religious liberty in almost the same wording that Jefferson used in the Virginia statute for religious liberty. I think I have the title of that wrong. But in fact, Jefferson's own copy of Tertullian is underlined. It doesn't mean all these folks in the late 1700s were reading folks from the 300s or even the medieval period, but it does mean, to quote the namesake of the Acton Institute, Lord Acton, that these liberties are the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. There's been centuries of historical and intellectual development. Now, that reader is meant to be in opposition to the Christian nationalists you cite or you refer to. You didn't name them, or their variety, which the Vice President of the United States flirts with a bit, the post-liberals and the Catholic integralists. All of those groups have this illiberal approach to religious liberty, and when you look at the sources, this is where I think I'd have a difference with Jonathan. I see a much less secular founding. I don't think of it in terms of the Enlightenment so much, but the deeper roots of it. I don't think the sources of these liberties are to be found in something like the secular Enlightenment, but more told probably in the more heavily Christian Scottish Enlightenment, but even previously. I'll stop there to share time.
All right, one last question. Lady in the middle row. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tassini. I'm a student at the college. I have a question regarding anyone who wants to answer. Your focus on heritage and ideal and how we go forward, especially in the perception of Gen Z on being proud of our nation, right? I'm hearing a lot of opinion in Gen Z specifically that this administration in particular is propelling a movement that is not reckoning with our past, if that makes sense. So while being proud of the things that we have accomplished, do you think that there is room to reckon with sort of slavery, racial segregation, women's rights issues, all of these things that have been a part of our nation and has been like a period of us figuring out what does liberty actually mean, right? So, and that's a huge part of our history. So what do you think about what the administration is doing currently in this ideal? And how do you think our nation can go forward, especially in terms of how Gen Z views our nation? So
it's a great question.
I want to start, if I might. Sorry, just barge in, so I think there's, first of all, looking around the world, there's many different ways to do ethnicity and things like this, and we have our way. We have the way we've been doing it, and for the last few decades, and then the way we've done it in other parts of our history. So there's no sort of absolute right way to do it. But there's obviously been a big shutdown of bureaucracies that are devoted to DEI. That's a major move of the administration. My view about it is that I'm not a big believer in bureaucracy, as mentioned Hayek before, but I am deeply opposed to not letting us talk about those things, or to introduce these bills we've seen in several of the red states where you can't talk about divisive concepts in the classroom, things like that. That is not just, it's beyond illiberal, it's authoritarian. It's the government trying to dictate what is truth. And so I think that's highly problematic. We have to debate these things. That's as American as apple pie and the Declaration of Independence, that we struggle over what liberty means. We get to talk about our history. We get to wrestle with the complexities and the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's what we do.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't think I think cancel culture is a real thing. I don't think the answer to cancel culture is cancel culture. And I think we should be clear on that. And just to the previous question, I mentioned my father came here during the pogroms, and he came here because of the part of why they came here was the freedom to worship as they saw fit. And we ought not to create we ought not to pervert what is a strength of the Constitution, I think, which is a guarantee of that. And the last thing I'd say on that is I wish that people who want to post the 10 Commandments, people in politics who want to post the 10 Commandments, would be as aggressively interested in observing them in some way. Anyway, go ahead.
Did you want?
Oh, I only had two comments about Gen Z. The first is we have an emerging leader program at Acton Institute, which is a global competitive program to internship there in the summer. There's some great students. I mean, these are mostly undergraduates. The second thing is, and that I learned from them, is part of the problem, and maybe behind the data cited earlier in the 27th percentile, whatever that was, is that I think too many folks identify what it means to be an American with the U.S. government, with government activities, with foreign policy, and they don't think about society, they don't think about culture, they don't think about their neighbor, they don't think about those things. They just think of government, government, government. And that's definitely a difference between now and the founding, which a lot of history in between, of course, explains.
Yeah, I would add, and this builds on what David was saying about cancel culture, is that I've also been critical of the moves in the administration and some states to limit discussions on campuses. I agree with David on that point. The problem is that we have not seen a reciprocal effort coming from higher education. I've been teaching for over 3 decades. I never imagined I would see higher education in the state it is today. This echoes what Scott had talked about. When I went here at the University of Chicago, it was a true awakening for me. I lived in the Dorchester Cooperative. We had Trotskyites that would meet in the basement. We had militant vegans that lived in the house. We had libertarians next door. I always describe it as walking into the scene, the bar scene in the Star Wars movie. I loved every minute of it. It's not that they changed my view. I loved talking with people that saw things that I was seeing and saw things completely differently. The fact is that most departments in this country have purged conservative and libertarian and contrarian faculty. Some don't have a single Republican. I had a debate with another Harvard law professor. It seems to be becoming a trend. But this one was at Harvard Law School itself, and it was whether Harvard's committed to intellectual diversity. And I noted that the Harvard faculty now is down to, if you're generous, 4 or 5 Republican conservatives on the entire faculty. And I asked Randy Kennedy, this is a country divided right down the middle, and yet you have only 4 or 5 conservatives, Republicans. And by the way, it's the majority of judges in this country follow that ideological side. And you have 4 or 5. And Randy said, we're an elite university. We don't have to look like America. And I said, Randy, you don't even look like Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts is 35% Republican. The point is only this, that when we talk about how this new generation is viewing the United States, most of our students go through higher education in an echo chamber of intense orthodoxy. There is incredible viewpoint intolerance in higher education. Some of us who are dissidents, we're the minority left. mean, on my faculty, when I first joined the faculty, it was 40% center-right, libertarians, conservatives. We're now down to 4 on a faculty of 180. And that is by no means unique. I mentioned that statistic at Georgetown Law School, and one of the faculty members came up and said, "What are you talking about? We're down to 2. You're doing twice as better than we are." The point is that we cannot have what is necessary for higher education unless we change that. And the faculty is not going to change that. And I've been talking to university presidents who want to change it. A lot of them want to change it. The faculty will not change it. I can tell you that right now. They just can't get themselves to do it. They can't get themselves to select someone that holds different views from them. It's going to be up to creating islands within universities, things like Hoover and others, to create new islands where students can actually talk with someone with a divergent view of the world. I think that once we have more of that diversity of thought, I think students, their perception will change as to what it is about this country. It's not that we agree, but that in fact we disagree. And we have a plurality of opinions.
Thank you, guys. This was a great panel. Just to wrap up, lunch will be served on the 10th floor of Rubenstein. Thank you guys for your time.